extraordinary introduction. It's kind of like attending your own funeral. But the mention of the horses makes me, I can't resist mentioning or putting in a plug for the Association Nationale des Cavaliers Catholiques that are going to have a pilgrimage for the first time ever outside of France and here in Great Britain at starting at Buckfast Abbey for the Assumption. So if you want to learn more about that, you can talk to me afterwards. But this evening, it's not. I'm not here to talk about my friends, the horses, but about the psychology of love. I propose to begin this evening by reciting the first song to love in Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside. To spare you the agony of hearing a kid from California attempt to read Chaucer in the original, I will recite it in a modern translation, and although something of the beauty of Chaucer's Middle English will be lost, I think this will be more than recompensed by the added facility in comprehension. The song is sung by the tragic hero, the Trojan warrior Troilus, who, after long mocking love and the silliness of lovers, has himself succumbed to its power by falling deeply in love with the noble Cresside. The experience is so new and disorienting to him that he exclaims, it's the first quotation there on the sheet, "If love it's not, O God, what feel I so? If love it is, what sort of thing is he? If love be good, from where then comes my woe? If he be ill, wondrous it seems to me that every torment and adversity that comes from him I can so joyous think. The more I thirst, the more from him I drink. If it is in my own delight I burn, from where then comes my wailing and complaint? Rejoicing, why to tears do I return? I know not, nor unwary, why I faint. O living death, O sweet harm, strange and quaint, how can this harm and death so rage in me? Unless I do consent that it so be. And if I do consent, I wrongly bewail my case. Thus rolled and shaken sore, all rudderless within a boat am I. Amid the sea and out of sight of shore, between two winds contrary evermore. Alas, what is this wondrous malady? For heat of cold, for cold of heat, I die." This song alerts Chaucer's audience that his poem is a study of love. If love it is, what sort of thing is he? What is this riot of emotion, this sweet agony and painful joy that sends us now one way, now another? Is love something we choose, or is it something that comes upon us like a sickness, a wondrous malady? And if love is a choice, is it possible to remain faithful to our beloved in spite of changes in fortune and feeling? Now, it may seem strange to start a talk on the Thomistic psychology of love with a quotation from Chaucer. St. Thomas Aquinas was principally concerned with the love of God, both God's love for us and our love for God in charity. In contrast to this, the vernacular tradition in which Geoffrey Chaucer wrote is viewed by most scholars as a secularization of the psychology of love, marking a shift from focusing on the love of God to focusing on the passionate romantic love between men and women. Nevertheless, one of Aquinas' great contributions to the theology of charity stems from his willingness to draw upon the human experience of love, especially as analyzed in the writings of pagan authors such as Aristotle, to deepen our understanding of divine love. From the Thomistic perspective, whatever we can learn about the nature of human love, even the confusing dynamics of romantic love, should be able to enrich our understanding of God's love and of our participation in it through the gift of charity. The need to return to human experience is heightened by the effects of 20th century controversies concerning charity on our understanding of Christian love. The battle lines of these controversies were set by Anders Nygrun's monumental agape and eros, which first appeared in the early 1930s. This extended attack on what Nygren understood to be the patristic and Catholic understanding of charity established a stark contrast between eros, viewed as a pagan love of desire that seeks its own satisfaction and is generated by the loved object's perceived value, and agape, viewed as Christian love that is unmotivated by the value of the loved object and is an unmotivated service of the other to the point of self-sacrifice for the other, even unto death. On one level, Nygren's study bore great fruit because it provoked several generations of scholars, Protestants and Catholics alike, to look anew at the biblical and patristic conceptions of love. Nygren's book was the proverbial grain of sand that led to such pearls as Martin Darcy's Mind and Heart of Love, Oliver O'Donovan's Problem of Self-Love in St. Augustine, Raymond Canning's Unity of Love for God and Neighbor in St. Augustine, and Czesław Speak's masterful volumes on agape in the New Testament. Nevertheless, the focus on the contrast between eros and agape has led to such an entrenchment of the discussion that there is need to fly above the battle lines to look anew and afresh on the field of love. This is why a voice from the first generation of the English vernacular can be of service. If the goal of true art, as Joseph Conrad argues, is to make us see, then Chaucer wants us to see something important about the complicated dynamics of love. In fact, he wants us to see many things, but this evening I want to focus on just one: the apparently inexplicable behavior of Chryseide, who, after so fully and nobly giving her heart to Troilus, very quickly gives her heart to Troilus's enemy, the Greek Diomedes. The poem is not a misogynistic attack on the inconstancy of women, as it is in Boccaccio's version of the story, but a sympathetic analysis of the mysterious inconstancy of the human heart. It is this question that I believe can help us see the continuing value of elements of Aquinas' psychology of love, especially in light of recent experimental and clinical studies into the psychology of love. The basic outline of Chaucer's story would already have been known to his audience. The action takes place during the siege of Troy, and Chaucer paints the bright colors of his love story upon the dark canvas of Troy's impending destruction. Troilus, the Iliad tells us, is one of King Priam's sons who, like his brother Hector, will ultimately be killed by Achilles. The character of Chryseide and her love triangle with Troilus and Diomedes was introduced by a 12th century Norman poet and further developed by other authors, but especially by Boccaccio. According to this literary tradition, Chryseide is the daughter of Calchas, a priestly defector to the Greeks. A widow, she has remained behind in Troy under the watchful eye of her uncle. Troilus falls in love with Chryseide, and with the help of her uncle, woos Chryseide until he wins her heart. Fate, however, interrupts their love, which they've kept secret, when Chryseide's father, having foreseen the destruction of Troy in an augury, arranges for Chryseide to be sent out to him among the Greek forces during a prisoner exchange. Faced with this tragic turn of events, the lovers profess their eternal fidelity, and Chryseide promises to do all she can to return to Troy and to her beloved Troilus. Gradually, however, while living among the Greeks, Chryseide abandons her resolve and gives her heart to Diomedes. Chaucer employs this traditional material to offer a nuanced and varied account of love. He details the characteristics of romantic infatuation as experienced by Troilus. He portrays the game of courtship, offering a compelling description of how Troilus wins Chryseide's heart. He describes their joy in the consummation of their love, and lastly, he outlines the fury and despair of love betrayed. For our purposes, however, two features of Chaucer's account deserve particular attention. First, although Chaucer knows well how love can become selfish pleasure-seeking, and disordered. Anyone who has read The Miller's Tale knows this. Throughout Troilus and Chryside, he celebrates the dignity of romantic love, seeing it as part of God's plan for creation and as an ennobling force. The narrator, for example, tells us that, quote, God loves and will not forbid to love, and no living creature in this world without love is worth anything or can endure. He then goes on to mock those who scorn love, affirming that although some men hold it to be folly, love is in fact a virtue. Indeed, the effect of love on Troilus, we are told, is that, quote, love made him flee pride and envy, anger and greed, and every other vice. Second, Chaucer portrays Troilus and Chryside during their time together in Troy as faithful and devoted lovers. Chryside even proclaims to Troilus, "Dear heart, in truth the game has now gone so far that sooner shall Phoebus, the sun, fall from his sphere, and every eagle mate with the dove, and every rock move from its place, than Troilus shall fade from Chryside's heart. You are so deeply engraved upon my heart that even if I were to die upon the rack, and even if I wished to turn you from my thoughts, may God save me, I could not." And yet, ultimately, Chryside abandons Troilus for another. This is what, as Corinne Saunders has noted, makes Chryside the central enigma of Chaucer's epic poem, and gives pointed meaning to Chaucer's investigations into the ultimate character of human love. Chaucer's treatment of love is given added intensity by the addition of an extended reflection on fate, on necessity, providence, and free will, which is largely drawn from Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. In this context, Chaucer probes two contrasting attitudes toward love. On the one hand, love is experienced as something that comes upon us, like a sickness, that takes possession of our hearts, even against our wills. This is how Troilus experiences it. And even Chryside, in the above-cited passage, expresses this sentiment. Even if I wished to turn you from my thoughts, may God save me, I could not. On the other hand, love is portrayed as a choice. Chryside pursues this line of reasoning throughout her courtship with Troilus. At the outset, she affirms, "I will not delude him with false hopes. I do not know how to love a man, and cannot against my will." Then later, when she began to fear his wooing, the narrator tells us that she calmed her fears in the following way. When she had fully considered, she found nothing perilous why she ought to fear. For it is possible that a man may love a woman until his heart splits, and she not love in return, unless she wishes. The narrator explains to us that it was only gradually and upon full reflection that she gave her heart to Troilus, but then fully and with joyful abandonment. This is what makes her later actions so puzzling, even to herself. As the narrator tells us, truly the history tells us that a woman never made more lament than she, when she became false to Troilus. Chaucer has her describe her plight and her resolve in the following terms. "I have betrayed one of the gentlest men that ever was, and one of the worthiest. But since I see there is nothing better, and that now is too late to repent, at least I will be true to Dione." And yet, she still retains a certain love for Troilus, speaking to him as if he were present. "Surely I shall never hate you, but you shall always have of me the love of a friend, and my words of praise, even if I should live forever. It is passages such as these that lead some scholars to describe Chaucer's poem, perhaps a bit intemperately, as the first English novel. He considers here with sympathy the complex relationship between choice and apparent necessity in love. Chryside's puzzlement is truly modern and remains with us. She well expresses the sentiments of many a husband or a wife who, with a surprising suddenness and after years of loving marriage, finds themselves in a new relationship. Her words could also apply equally well to many a priest or religious who, after years of service, choose a different life. It is important to underline here that Chaucer doesn't portray Chryside's action as the result of simple fickleness, pleasure-seeking, or a clearly selfish egotism. Her new allegiances remain something of a mystery to herself as well. This, too, has a very contemporary ring. Robert Bellah, in his extraordinary study of contemporary American culture, Habits of the Heart, found, more than 20 years ago now, that many of those whom he interviewed had at midlife undergone radical changes in lifestyle and priorities that often included new marriages. The disturbing feature of these changes, however, is that the subjects whom Bellah's team interviewed were rarely able to explain why they had gone from one way of living to another, from one marriage to another. Indeed, they often remained friends with their former spouses and expressed sentiments not too distant from those of Chryside. Annie Dillard explores the same dynamic in her novel, The Maytrees. After leaving his wife of many years, having run off with his wife's best friend, Toby Maytree reflects in later years on his strange experience of love. This is a longer quotation. Why can love apparently absolute, recur and recur? Why does love feel know for certain it is, eternal and absolute every time? Three explanations for love's recurrence presented. Perhaps everyone gathers or grows an enormous sack of love he hands whole from one beloved to another. In this instance, the beloved is love's hat rack. Or second, perhaps love is delusional. The heart never learns and keeps leaping the length of its life, rising to lures made of rubber, hiding hooks. Or third, perhaps he never really loved Lou, let alone his other girlfriends, and having learned love by loving, had found in Dearie his true mate at last. All three, even the usually irresistibly tempting true mate at last hypothesis, for which both Maytree and Dearie were by now many years too experienced, apostatized. They apostatize by saying love between man and woman, or anyone and anyone, beyond those 18 months that science allows for infatuation, was imaginary, or theater, or inertia, or convenience. A view looking to Maytree ever more plausible, but he knew that he had truly loved Lou for years, and still did. The lasting love he studied, not mere emotion, might be willful focus of attention. It might be a custody of reactions. He circled this view for years. Love as directed will did not sound like love's first feeling of cliff jumping. Call that period 18 months or 7 years. Call it anything but infatuation. It must be acknowledged and accounted for. In the end, Maytree remains stumped, and like Chryside's resigned dedication to Diomed, remains with his second wife, having, in good New England fisherman fashion, quote, wrapped his hands around oars, iced them fast, and kept rowing. And yet, as he said, these two aspects of love, the cliff jumping and the directed will, must be acknowledged and accounted for. It is here that Aquinas' insights into love can be of service. Yes, finally, we arrive at Aquinas. The perennial temptation is either to reduce love to a pure choice of the will or to a mere emotional response. For Aquinas, however, love is both. Just as the human intellect for Aquinas cannot know except in and through the senses and imagination, so too for Aquinas the human will loves in and through the emotions, in and through the bodily passion that is love. In the biblical sense, this is what heart means. It is the center of affectivity, both bodily and spiritual. Or better, heart is a spiritual affectivity that animates the body and breathes through it. Aquinas arrives at this conclusion, however, from a surprising angle, one that is very foreign to we moderns, from an analysis of motion. Aquinas shares with the ancients the view that all motion is somehow caused by love. Stated another way, since all we do as humans seems to be the result of our desires, our loves, and since we are part of a larger natural world, something that post-Descartes we try very hard to hide from ourselves, since we are a part of a larger natural world, our motions probably share something in common with the motion of other things. And this common element is what Aquinas is willing to call, analogously, love. But what is this common element? In local motion, the motion presupposes a certain capacity or potency to move in that way or to a certain spot. I can walk across the room, but I can't walk across the ceiling or fly to the top of a steeple. But is potency a sufficient explanation, potency alone, a sufficient explanation of what is common to the character of love? For although I have the capacity to be someplace I'd rather not be, in prison, for example, and although I can even be taken there against my will, we wouldn't want to call this potency for prison a love for prison. The element of love that is common to other things would seem to be reserved to natural motions. A stone falling to the earth, or an acorn becoming an oak, or the deer longing for flowing streams. What these cases add to the general notion of capacity is affinity. The deer has an affinity for water, the acorn for growing into an oak. And after Einstein, we can once again say that the stone has a certain affinity for the earth toward which it falls. St. Thomas uses several different terms to convey this affinity. Affinitas, aptitudo, connaturalitas, convenientia, or even inclinatio. But in the case of human love, both as an emotion and as an act pertaining to the will, Aquinas' preferred term is complacentia. Complacency is too weak a translation in English for complacencia. For Aquinas, complacentia is the Latin equivalent of the Greek eudoxia, which literally means satisfaction or approval, and regularly conveys the notion of being well pleased, of being a pleasing affective affinity for some object judged to be good, whether an action, object, or person. Aquinas thus defines love in the following way. The aptitude of the sensitive appetite or of the will to some good, that is to say, its very complacency in good, is called sensitive love, or intellectual or rational love. So that sensitive love is in the sensitive appetite, while intellectual love is in the intellectual appetite, namely the will. Or again, the first change caused in the appetite by the appetible object is called love, and is nothing else than complacency in that object. Someone at this point might object that love seems to be more than merely a principle of motion. Indeed, we usually refer to love as an act. When we say the person loves something, it's to desire something or will the good to someone. Aquinas recognizes this. It develops the following schema. The act of love in the emotions is desire when the loved object is absent, and pleasure when it is present. In the will, the act of love is to will some good for someone, for oneself, or another. When the good is absent, we desire it, we will it for the other. When the good is present, we delight or rejoice in that good when it is there. And as Joseph Pieper explains, the primary good we will for another is that he or she exists. To love them on the most fundamental level is to affirm it's good that you exist. It's good that you are in this world. All these acts of love, however, to desire, to find pleasure in, to will the good of another, or to rejoice in that good, all of these things presuppose something existing in us beforehand. They presuppose a certain affinity for the loved object at the outset. One doesn't desire to have foie gras or find it pleasurable to eat it unless they have a certain affinity for it. If I cannot stand goose liver, I'm not going to desire it when absent, nor enjoy eating it when it is placed before me. And so therefore, all these acts of love presuppose something first. But at this point, someone else who has been following and accepted Aquinas' analysis may object, how does any of this help us understand the plight of Maitre or Chrysaide? Indeed, if all Aquinas had to offer was a theory of love as complacencia, he would be of little help. St. Thomas, however, adds three further elements to his theory of love. First, love in the will, spiritual love, differs from the emotion of love, sense love, in that the will's love is a choice. This is why for Aquinas, although amor is the general Latin term for love and can be applied to all loves, dilectio is most properly the Latin word for love in the will, because spiritual love presupposes a choice, electio. Secondly, following Aristotle, Aquinas holds that our choices are deeply influenced by our passions, especially the desires, loves of our emotional life. This is so because things appear to us according to our characters, and our characters are shaped by our loves. Lastly, although we can reshape our characters by training and ordering our passions, this is what Aquinas means by developing the virtues, such reordering is no easy task. It is here that recent research in clinical and experimental psychology can help us understand the lasting value of Aquinas' theory of love on these points, and how his theory can help the Trolluses and the Chrysaides of our own day. The last 20 years has seen an explosion of interest in the dynamics of human love among experts from what are known as the biopsychosocial sciences. The evolving views on love, their evolving views on love, can best be seen by comparing the entries in the 1988 volume, The Psychology of Love, with the articles in the 2006 collection entitled The New Psychology of Love. Although paradoxically, none of the authors in these volumes provides a general definition of love, they do offer interesting insights into the dynamics of affection, attraction, attachment, and the importance of emotional nurturing and care. A full account of their findings would take us too far afield, but Lewis, Amini, and Lannon, in their volume, A General Theory of Love, These are three psychiatrists, research psychiatrists at UCSF, University of California at San Francisco. In their general theory of love, attempt a synthesis that they cluster around three features proper to human emotion. First, limbic or emotional resonance. I use emotional, they use limbic. So limbic resonance, limbic regulation, and limbic revision. Limbic is just a big word for the part of the brain that is the center for emotion, according to most theories. So emotional resonance, emotional regulation, and emotional revision. What are these three dynamics? Emotional resonance is the ability we have to perceive the emotions of others. So, for example, lizards, you may have a pet lizard, and you may shower it with emotion, but your pet lizard is not able to read your emotional affection. Same goes for alligators. They can't connect emotionally. But humans can. Most mammals can. So this ability to read emotion, and the studies are fascinating, how the basic emotions are universally recognizable in all cultures. And that children are born with the ability to recognize and try to imitate the expressions on the faces of the first people they see. So infants are hardwired to look for emotional expression, and they respond to it. Just two examples. There was a Greek doctor who got permission from about 250 couples to have the woman give birth in a room that had a black background. He was dressed in black, but his face was lit. And he would make faces to the newborns. And he could see that they were trying to imitate his expressions. And if they made a mistake, they were even capable of correcting their mistakes. So infants are hardwired to read the emotion of that primal other. Why? Because emotional experiences are how we learn what is beneficial and what is dangerous for us in our environment. And from the very moment that children are born, they read this. This gets us to the second second theory here, which is emotional regulation. The infant, especially the relationship between the infant and mother, is able to have his emotional life regulated by that primal other. And it regulates that infant's behavior. So, for example, if you have a toddler who's now just learned to crawl, and you have what's called a false clip, which you have a pen, or it's usually a circular enclosure, and half of it looks solid, and the other half has a plexiglass platform, and it looks like there's nothing there. And if you have the mother on the other side of the plexiglass, if the mother's face is neutral, the baby will crawl and maybe hesitate at the cliff, but keep going. If the mother expresses fear, the baby will stop at the cliff. And if the mother expresses anger, the baby will start to go back from the cliff. So infants connect immediately emotionally with the primal other, and they modify their own emotional life and their own behavior according to that connection. The research is astounding. There's also a lot of research in favor of co-sleeping. The baby learns in the womb how to regulate its heart, but it learns in those first few months how to regulate its breathing. And so the baby automatically turns towards the mother's heart when it's laid next to the mother, and the breathing of the two become regulated. All of this learning that goes on, we have emotional resonance, the ability to read the emotion of others, and emotional regulation, the ability to have our emotional life and our actions, our perceptions of other things regulated, our perception of value regulated by the emotional reactions of others. And emotional revision. The good news is that someone who's had a bad beginning, where they have been scripted in many ways that make them attracted to unhealthy objects of affection, this can be re-scripted, reordered. So this is the quote, I love this quote from their book. In a relationship, this is concerning emotional revision. In a relationship, one mind revises another. One heart changes its partner. This astounding legacy of our combined status as mammals and neural beings is limbic revision, the power to remodel the emotional parts of the people we love. As our attractors activate certain limbic pathways and the brain's inexorable memory mechanism reinforces them, who we are and who we become depends in part on whom we love. In this year of the beatification of Cardinal Newman, what better expression of his motto, cor ad cor loquitur? What this paragraph is saying here is our own experiences, our own emotional life, just by being in relationship with another person, can regulate that other person's life. Now, the authors of this book sing the praises of psychotherapy as the way to do this rescripting, because they'll say if you don't have a professional there, you'll inevitably be attracted, if you've had unhealthy attractors in your life, to the very people who aren't right for you. But there's another conclusion that one can draw, and this draws us back to our examples of Chrysaide, and I want to end with this. How could she have been helped? If Thomas is right that the love and the will is a choice, and if he's also right that our choices are deeply influenced by our emotions, our emotional loves, and if these three categories of emotional resonance, emotional regulation, and emotional revision are true, then it points to the fact that she would have been, and she would have needed to be, supported in her choice by a community. And first, by her own emotional life, supported by a community. And let's look at the ways in which this can happen. Again, turning to Chaucer. A key step in the courtship of Chrysaide is her hearing one of her relatives, provocatively named Antigone, who's the heroine of the natural law, as Maritain tells us, singing a song to love. And hearing this song and having it enter her heart and meditating on the song removes her last objections to being wooed by Troilus. What implications does that experience have for the Christian life? All too often in our contemporary Christian communities, we are too focused on what the scientists would say, the neocortex, on words. But the deepest training, the level of our emotional training, the level at which our choices are deeply influenced, and I'll come back to that with the example of Phineas Gage, that level is shaped more, not by words, but by song, by entering into the song of a community, entering into, with others, the emotional responses of that community in their love for God. A community's love for God, literally, by being present to that community, scripts our emotional life and scripts how we love each other. Look at the Psalms. This will bring me back in conclusion to Aquinas' choice of complacencia. Where does he get it? I spent several years trying to find out where this came from, what the roots of it were. But its roots are in the translation from Matthew's Gospel into Latin. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased, complacui. And at the Transfiguration, the same expression. Now in Matthew's Gospel, that phrase, from God the Father, is the first time the word love is used in the New Testament. Not by accident. This is my beloved Son. Dilectio is there. Dilectus, in whom I am complacui. But more importantly, the beloved Son is first mentioned, if you follow the Septuagint, in Genesis 22. The very first reference in the Old Testament to the Hebrew word love is God saying to Abraham, take your beloved son, whom you love, and go sacrifice him. The preparation for our discovery of the quality and character of love is often in the absence of the beloved. Abraham discovers, it actually says, the place name there, and the exegetes can correct me with the Hebrew here. The place name is often translated, God will provide, but it's, I have seen. God has revealed himself. What has he revealed? He's revealed the character of his love, the Father's love for a son. St. Augustine says that as we pray the Psalms, whose voice do we hear? It's the songs of Christ himself, in joy, in sorrow, in suffering, in delight. The Psalms, therefore, the songs of the community, shape our hearts, shape our loves, shape our lives. But life in community, if we are loving God together, also through emotional resonance, emotional regulation, and emotional revision, shape our lives and shape our loves. This is what leads Chaucer to have the narrator, after the tragedy has unfolded, after Achilles has killed Troilus, to sing, because these were often sung, this poem was sung, to sing to his audience, O young joyous people, youths and maidens in whom love ever grows up with your age. Get yourself home from worldly vanity. Cast up the eyes of your heart to that God that made you after his image, and think that all this world is but a temporary amusement, and passes as soon as the sweet flowers. And love him who, for pure love, to redeem our souls, first died upon the cross and rose again, and now sits on high in heaven. He will fail no creature, of that be sure, who will set his heart wholly on him. And since he is most gentle and best to love, what need to seek feigned loves? And he concludes, as we can. And now to that true Christ who died on the cross, I pray with all my heart for mercy. And to the Lord I say this, thou 1, 2, 3, eternally alive, that ever in 3, 2, 1 reigns uncircumscribed, yet circumscribes all. Defend us from our foes, visible and invisible, and make us, Jesus, worthy of your mercy, for the love of your kind maiden and mother. Amen.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that thoughtful and pleasing and pleasurable meditation on love. Some of us earlier were thinking we should have some music playing as people were coming in. And the Beatles, of course, were suggested. And tell you the age of the people talking about it. 1968, California, we looked to California for love. But thankfully it's come in a richer route.
Was one who, as a 5-year-old, remembers the summer of love on the shores of San Francisco. A 5-year-old has a very different experience of what that was like.
Okay, we have some time, 10-15 minutes, and Michael says he's happy to hear responses or to respond to questions. So if anybody would like to take.
Yes, I was intrigued by you say Aquinas is influenced by a view of Aristotle in the natural world, that love is what drives all motion. Mm-hmm. And even though you said you've forgotten after Descartes, it's also the case that physics, or a view of the world, a general view of the world, has shifted so that we don't think that love moves the stars. And in fact, we think that things move uniformly without an end. And not only this physically, but there's an analogy of this psychologically in people's lives. And I think of enduring love, Ian Kuhn. That there's a sense of love not as looking for an end, but as a force pushing in a direction, not towards anything, but just forcefully. And that there might be some still analogy in modern culture, as in medieval culture, between the natural world and psychology, but a rather grimmer one in the modern world than in the medieval. That is to say, destructive love in nature and destructive love in our own lives. Could you comment on how to escape that?
I think that you've expressed it excellently. A couple of things. First of all, that vision is a Newtonian vision, right? And Newton is still taught in all the schools, with always a little promissory note that eventually, if you keep with physics, you'll get beyond this. But the mechanical world is basically taught, and it's taught with in a fideistic way. If you look at the physics books, these things are told to you, and you're supposed to believe them. So that's the first thing to think about. So we as a culture live by certain myths that scientists and others know are myths, but the cultural machinery, that is those who teach our children, and the media, and even journals like Scientific American, still live a kind of cultural myth. So that's the first thing that I would say. Second, if you return to, and I've often said to my students that I'd like them to tattoo on one wrist participation and on the other wrist analogy. Because if you really understand what we mean by participation analogy, even without a full fideist notion of things, you can recover a unity of motion that is not far from what Aquinas was holding. But it requires, in order to be intelligible to our contemporaries, a recovery of the notion of participation in analogy. And I'll give you an example. I remember I was taking a wonderful class. This is a multimedia class back in the 80s, when I was an undergraduate, early 80s, at Berkeley, on for non-majors, so for people in arts and letters, take a science class. And this was on coevolution, which was the hot topic, and punctuated evolution. And it was a wonderful class. And I remember two things that were surprising about this class. One was they presented to dismiss and laugh at the notion that the stone falls to the ground because it loves the ground. You know, aren't the medievals and the ancients quaint? But when you really understand what they're saying is, they don't have a univocal sense of predication. They have a sense of analogy. So that something is similar about the movement of a stone and the growth of a tree and the desire of a deer for water in all of these things. And we, as part of the natural kingdom, our movement is also has principles that are analogous. Not the same, but analogous. And if you look at the strivings of a lot of people in the environmentalist movement, a lot of people who are trying to find their way to a unified vision where we, once again, have animality in our definition, I think you can make common cause. I mean, I think you can help people to see. You have to kind of perhaps not, make Aquinas the champion of it, and it's not my vocation to do that directly, but I think you can recover a philosophy of nature, because that's what we're talking about. And there are scientists, I think of the folks down in at Los Alamos. There are groups of scientists trying to recover a philosophy of nature. So in Tucson, I was there for 3 years. Artists and scientists are open to these questions. So I think there's a lot that can be done. But you can't get anywhere without the notion of participation and analogy. That would be my answer.
Well, first of all, thank you. It was a very interesting, informative lecture. I really enjoyed it. I just had two questions. So the first one was you were talking about how in a community, especially in a religious community or a church, we learn about love from each other, and we learn that in relation to the love for God. How do you feel? I mean, obviously this happens in any family or any organization, but in churches especially where, well, not especially, but in this case particularly, when people might talk about love or, think about love or, profess about love, but it doesn't necessarily match up with your actions. Do you think that has a worse effect because it's in a religious community? Or do you think that's kind of one of the aspects of learning about love, to realize that it's not necessarily just what you say, it's also what you do?
Yeah, I think there's that challenge, and there's also the challenge of trying to educate people in a morality that is not rooted in an intimate love relationship with God. I think a lot of what I witnessed, again, very young, seeing an older group of young people reacting. They were reacting to a morality that was no longer lived in a relationship with an intimate relationship with God. My mom, my mom was at Berkeley in the late 40s, and she was in a sorority, and she said, it's really strange. All of my friends' parents, and my parents and all my friends' parents are deeply religious. So the generation before World War II, the First World War generation. But hardly any of my friends are religious. And she remembers thinking, I wonder what's going to happen to their children. Well, we saw what happened to their children. A kind of nationalist public morality that's based on the remnants of Christianity, without a lived love relationship with God, led to wholesale rejection. And that the generation has been trying to find its way ever since. One of the ways of recovering from rationalism is to recover our animality. And the way you recover your animality and practical reasoning is by recovering our understanding of how emotion shapes our judgments. And I can't resist giving the example of Phineas Gage, which I forgot to mention. Phineas Gage was a very respected chief of a railroad crew. And in the old days, they used to make tunnels by boring holes, putting in sticks of dynamite, and then pounding it in the right order with bars of iron. And this crew made a mistake, and it exploded. And it went through Phineas Gage. We have his skull. They've done extensive studies. It went through in here and out the top of his head. And he never lost consciousness. It destroyed his limbic brain, but it didn't destroy his ability to reason. Speculative reasoning. He no longer had his emotional memory. He no longer had his emotional life. He went from being a very respected, very disciplined leader of men. He never lost consciousness, he recovered, but his life fell apart. He was no longer able to make practical judgments. He could tell you how to run a railroad crew. He could tell you how to do things, but he couldn't practically do them. His life unraveled. So the influence of emotional memory shapes our judgments. It doesn't determine who we are, but it has a profound influence on our judgments. And so those choices, Chryside's choice, influenced by her affectivity, and her affectivity is influenced by her community.
Curious, love is of course a term that's used to translate an enormous variety of terms in Aquinas' work. Most of your references are from the section on the passions, it seems. There's also, of course, love as a supernatural virtue, and there's also love as a fruit of the Holy Spirit. So in fact, there's all this big toolkit around. I just wondered whether you think all these things are always combined together, and when do you think God sometimes has to withdraw one to allow others to flourish? I'm thinking perhaps of Isaiah, no looks to attract our eyes. It seems that are almost repressed, perhaps to allow character to flourish. What would you have to say on that?
A couple of things. It's very, very interesting and revelatory. This is kind of a plug for tomorrow's talk on method. To see why Aquinas presents love and the will in the Treatise of the Passions. Why does he do it? Aquinas has the practice of addressing spiritual reality by drawing on spiritual realities we don't have any direct experience of. we have a concomitant experience, but it's not, we can't, it's very difficult to reflect on. So it's always in and through some physical bodily analogy. So we learn and we're able to articulate what love and the will is by paying attention to what love and the passion is. And as someone who believes in participation and analogy, unlike moderns that want to have univocal predication, he's able to speak in a certain sense polyphonically. So for example, it causes terrible trouble in the analysis of human action. When he's talking about the end and its relationship to the act, he means the end viewed without distinguishing between proximate end and remote end. So that ability to speak in general about the end in relation to the act has caused havoc because we don't speak polyphonically. Well, the same is true, I think, in the treatment here. So he's presenting spiritual love in that context. I emphasized that same kind of context. Clearly, I have very strong views about the priority of charity and all of that. But I thought it was enough if I can just convey this notion of complacency as a choice in the will and as opposed to the other. Certain sacrifices are required of us because of the effects of original sin that wouldn't have otherwise been required. And the cross is our medicine. So yes, there are, and the other thing I have not distinguished between, because again, speaking polyphonically, between acquired virtue, which is revelatory, but the priority is the infused virtues. And for Aquinas, the priority, I would argue strongly, the priority is infused cardinal virtues. But the focus is on acquired because by analogy with the acquired, we grow in the infused. And so the infused life, the growth in virtue that way, is by analogy with everything I said. So I was speaking polyphonically. I wasn't distinguishing between the acquired and the infused because I didn't need to on this point. Just as he doesn't when he's talking on the passion.
Thank you for the very good one question I want to ask is, you mentioned original sin. Do you think that, I know many people are Christian and there is a huge alternative of definition of love now, but also there is a male separation also and female separation also. Do you think that, anyway, when people love, generally, that they are looking whether they believe in God or not. So they are looking for God in a way, because God is love, and God is hope, beauty, and all everything that people get to have is out of mind. Do you think that anyway that people are looking to come back to this kind of lost love in the garden of Eden, the love which is you spoke about also communion and community, because ultimately it's a job in the garden of Eden and God. And the original sin that actually been undermined this, and that we are all looking for that. I think modern Christians say also out of this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think my short answer to that would be yes. I think Augustine develops that very beautifully. And it's a theme that was also dear to the heart of Chesterton and Lewis and a lot of English writers. Even the one who is sinning is in some way pursuing God in some way. And the interesting thing about reordering our loves, even if the person starts out without belief in God, once you start to reorder your loves, you were led, or you're disposed, it's all under grace and providence, but you're disposed often to figure out, well, who's on the top of this ordering of love? There was a program, I managed to get horses back in. There's a program at the University of Oklahoma put together by a person named John Senior, which tried to introduce, it was a kind of Western Civ program, and it introduced undergrads to the practices of medieval culture. And this state school, this program at a state school became a factory of conversions. And not only conversions to Catholicism, but vocations to religious life. until the daughter of a big benefactor was converted, and they were able to shut down the program. But as McIntyre would say, you learn a practice, you enter into a practice, it starts to organize and order your loves. And whether it's the practice of learning to ride a horse or the practice of playing chess, if you dedicate yourself to some art in an ordered way, very often leads much farther than you at first perceive. And I think it's often related to this whole notion of emotional resonance, regulation, and revision.
Thank you, Michael. I'm afraid we'll have to bring it to an end at this point. Before we thank Michael, can I just draw your attention to these? One is a list of the Aquinas seminars which are happening this term. These are at 4:30 on Thursdays and last for an hour and a half each time. Just come along if you wish to any or all of these. This is the annual Aquinas Colloquium, which will be on the 5th of March, Saturday 5th of March, and as you can see is devoted to the writings of Herbert McCabe on the 10th anniversary of his death. You would need to contact me if you want to come to this. There are already about 30 people have indicated that they want to be here. They could be in this room, so as you can see, we have to set a limit to the attendance. But contact me about this. Come along anytime about this. The other announcement is that there is a reception in the refectory to which you're all very welcome immediately after now. Just left and left again, and you're in the refectory. That will go on till about 6:45. The usual thing for those of you who are familiar with us, when the bell will ring for Vespers, the community will have Vespers in the Priory Church, and you're welcome to come into the Priory Church and join us for Vespers if you wish. Finally, on your behalf, just once again to thank Michael. Fribourg is an important centre for us in the Thomistic world, and we're good friends. There's a complacencia between the Institute of St. Thomas in Fribourg and the Aquinas Institute in Oxford, and I'm very grateful on your behalf to express our thanks to Michael for his lecture. Thank you.